Welcome to Meeting of the Minds, the interview discussion show that explores topics in the atheism-theism landscape in a civil and respectful manner. My name's Christopher Mowdy, and I'm your host, and I'm honored to have with me Paul Taylor, Director of Ministry Development at Creation Today Ministries in Pensacola, Florida. You can visit them at creationtoday.org, and he's also author of several books, including his most recent, Don't Miss the Boat, Facts to Keep Your Faith Afloat, available at the Creation Today store, as well as at iBooks and Kindle, which is where I got mine. And we're going to discuss things like his topics, including his ministry, his book, apologetics in general, the atheist community, and scientific literacy. How are you doing this afternoon, Paul?
I'm very well, thank you. Very honored to be speaking with you, so thank you for inviting me.
Indeed. Thanks for showing up. As with all of my guests, I have some introductory questions. Now, I have to admit that you have a little more prestige and popularity than the guests that I've had in the past, and so people may already know the answers to these questions. But I think that I've been given a little bit of time by the grace of Joey, and I'm going to ask them of you anyway, just so that for the people that may not be familiar with you, when we get into the discussion part of the show, they'll be able to have a framework to work within your answers within. So the first question I have is, how would you identify or label yourself?
I'm a Christian. I suppose I would label myself as a Bible-believing Pentecostal Christian. That's how I usually label myself.
Okay, and how would you describe that worldview to us?
As a worldview, it's a worldview that starts it starts with God. So I accept the existence of God and the truth of the Bible, and everything that I would view would be viewed through that particular lens.
Okay, and your interpretation of the Bible, how would you consider it? And I have it broken down into two explanations, orthodox versus non-orthodox. Orthodox would be the complete, revealed, inspired Word of God, as compared to non-orthodox, which would allow for some interpretation of the humans that wrote it.
I don't use either of those terms because they can be misunderstood.
Okay.
I mean, does Orthodox mean Greek Orthodox or what? I would... my reading of the Bible is the historical, grammatical reading of the Bible, where each book of the Bible is written according to a different style of literature, and each book of the Bible is true according to that particular style of literature. And it's pretty straightforward, really, to see what each book is trying to say. I don't tend to have complex theories on what any particular book is trying to say.
Okay. And how old is the Earth?
Well, the Bible maintains that the Earth is approximately 6,000 years old, so obviously that's the figure that I would take.
Okay, and how old is the universe?
The Earth and the universe would have been created at the same time.
Okay. And what is your opinion of the biological theory of evolution?
The biological theory of evolution is something that I came to reject in my late teens, and science studies through my 20s at university gave me no reason to change that view.
Okay. And in your personal journey up through to your current belief, were you ever in a place that you would call yourself an atheist?
Difficult to say, really. Probably not. I certainly wasn't always a believer in... I certainly wasn't always somebody who knew God, the God of the Bible. I was brought up in a church background, however, but being brought up in a church background is not always helpful, because I just knew quite a lot about God, but didn't actually know God. So... during my teen years, you're thinking through a lot of things, and I often wondered whether God existed, and sort of swung between thinking, well, probably he doesn't, or probably he does, and those sort of questions really were resolved for me by the time of my late teens, I would guess.
Okay. All right. Well, those are the introductory questions, and now I'd like to get into the discussion part of the show, and I'd like to get into it just by asking you a general question and ask you to tell us a little bit about Creation Today and your role as Director of Ministry Development.
Well, Creation Today is a ministry that declares the truth of God's Word from the very first book of the Bible. And the ministry is based in Pensacola, Florida. It's led by my friend and boss, Eric Hovind. And I guess that there are quite a few creation ministries around which are packed with highly qualified scientists. Ours is not. We honor what they do and study what they do. We are popularizers of the message self-consciously. So our main role as a ministry would be to we broadcast a weekly television show which we record called the Creation Today Show, which can be found on our website and on some networks around the country and in other countries. We broadcast in New Zealand and in the United Kingdom as well. And so that basically, I think, describes what we do.
Okay. And you're director as director of ministry development?
Yes, and in my role, I write articles, I write books, and I speak on the subject of creation and evolution and the Bible.
Okay, so I'd like to talk about Creation Today's role in the general landscape of apologetics for a second. So even though I'm an atheist, I have to admit that I am a huge fan of the Creation Today show that you do with Eric Hovind. And I think is it in its third season now or fourth?
Yes, we started the third season.
Okay, third season. And even before that, before your involvement, when it was Creation Science Evangelism, led by Kent Hovind, I think that I spent hundreds of hours watching and rewatching his videos, including his CSE college courses. So I'm super interested in the information that is delivered from Creation Today. So it seems that for a time, the evidential apologetic was all the rage. And by that, I mean apologists used to spend a lot more time discussing the evidence to support the notion for their flavor of creation or the flood, or the flood, something that you do very well. But lately, there seems to be a new trend in apologetics where the presuppositional apologetic is becoming popular. I'd like you to take a moment and comment on that and as to why you think that is and what your take is on the shift in general.
I guess there have been one or two people who have become well known in the last few years who've taken the presuppositional approach, and I suppose it's certain characters who've become popular. Now, I've been speaking on this subject from a presuppositional point of view for probably about 20 years. Prior to that, I was taking an evidential view. And you might say, well, look, I know some of your stuff and I've seen evidences that you've mentioned. That's true. And the thing is, I talk about evidences a lot. The point is that I maintain that all evidences are viewed and interpreted through a person's worldview. So any evidences that I talk about are within that particular context, because quite often evidences can be used in different ways. It's the context and the background that people have that matter, and that's how we understand them.
Okay, so you would say that you've been a presuppositionalist for much longer, regardless of the current trend, based on the popular characters, as you put it.
I was a presuppositionalist before I knew the word.
Oh, I see. So, so the fact that it's labeled presuppositionalism now is just part of the trend itself, maybe? Like it's the fact that people have been saying that the facts are the facts and the way that you interpret them is based on your worldview has been around for a longer time than the trend of presuppositional itself?
It's been around a very long time. As I said, I've been involved in that, and my friend and mentor Ken Ham has always spoken from that point of view. Again, providing a lot of evidence, but always from the point of view of setting it in the context, in the worldview that people understand.
Okay. In doing research for this interview, I came across a presentation of yours named Deconstructing Dawkins, referring, of course, to Richard Dawkins. So I'm curious to get your take on what has been termed the new atheist movement. And because as an atheist, I see it as causing some harm as well as some good to the atheist community. And I always use that in air quotes. So what's your take?
Yeah, actually, I'd be quite interested to know what your take is in some ways. And it's very interesting that I did a TV interview back in Britain. Your the people watching your show will probably have got the idea by now that I'm not from around these parts, by the way I speak. And obviously, I grew up and lived in Britain for a long while. Moved to the United States just about over 2.5 years ago, and I did a TV interview on Sky News and with a very senior member, and I should probably not mention his name because he'll want to deny it, but a very senior member of the British Humanist Association. And I chatted to him in the green room afterwards about a very pleasant man. I chatted to him in the green room afterwards about what I saw as the new atheists, people like Richard Dawkins, and he said we see him as a loose cannon. We think he's doing far more harm to the atheist cause than anything else, and he's probably the best recruiting officer you creationists could ever have. So yes, there does seem to be an atheist fundamentalism has arisen, really.
Dogma. The new atheist movement has introduced dogma into atheism, in my opinion, for some people.
Yes, I mean, I'm I remember an interview that Richard Dawkins did, and I don't know whether you saw this particular program in the United States, but he did a set of 4 programs about atheism for the British Channel 4 network. There was one point in which he interviewed a pastor in Colorado Springs. Trying to remember the name of the pastor. He's actually a pastor who
Ted Haggart.
Sorry?
Ted Haggart.
That's the one. Yes. So I know he had problems of his own, so I'm not going to defend that man. But what I just noticed in his interview was that looking at Richard Dawkins' face, he was very angry indeed. And I thought to myself, why is he that bothered? Why does it really upset him so much that people don't believe the same things that he believes? I mean, it doesn't make me angry that there are atheists in the world. It doesn't make me angry when friends of mine tell me that they're atheists. Why should it make me angry? It perhaps makes me sad, and I want to talk to them, and I'm sure they want to talk to me, and persuade each other differently. And obviously, I will want to talk to them because I believe it's absolutely vital. Since you know what I believe about what happens when people die, then clearly there would be something wrong with me if I wasn't concerned to speak to people about that. But
yes, and it's almost your obligation, right? As far as it's the blind man walking towards the end of the cliff analogy.
Absolutely. I mean, it would show, believing what I do, it would show that I didn't actually care.
For the people that are watching, they obviously don't know that you and I have corresponded via email a little bit in the past. And I've always tried to present myself as the non-angry, non-militant atheist person. We've been able to have really nice exchanges. And that's what I really appreciated about you. And that's one of the reasons why I felt comfortable reaching out to you to be on the show.
And I'll be fair, that's not uncommon. And yet, you talk about Richard Dawkins, there seems to be an anger in his face that he really hates people who disagree with him. And now I may be doing an injustice, okay?
No. I've no problem with you.
It seems to me as if he really hates people who disagree with him.
Oh, yeah. I brought up to Richard Dawkins, absolutely. So speaking of him, let me talk a little bit more about what the harm that I think he's done, just to make you smile. Here's the problem with the militant atheists, and I've said this before. At least for the militant, fundamental Christians, they're at least striving. The ones that are misguided in their process, as much as maybe some people believe with their content. At least they're trying to be Christ-like in some way, shape, or form, right? For militant atheists, some of them are just trying to replicate the shrillness of a Dawkins, and they just don't have the bona fides to back it up.
Well, I think you're right, and that's the sort of attitude I get in emails. And to be honest, some of them, I have to say, amuse me. I answered a Facebook message yesterday from somebody who said, people who believe in creationism are all idiots.
And what do you do with that?
What is the point? And I wondered, why did he sit down at his laptop and waste his time, if that's what he believes? Why did he actually waste the electricity going through his laptop?
Yeah, what's the purpose of communication if you're just going to like lob bombs from the sidelines? I don't get that at all.
I had an interesting experience in London, England. I was invited to speak at a meeting called Atheists in the Pub. And they meet in, now I've forgotten which pub it is, because I'd be quite happy to tell you where it is. If anyone is in London and visit, I'd be quite happy to let you know, but I can't remember. So maybe someone will email in and remind me. But okay. I had an interesting time there. They invited me. I presume it was, for entertainment value largely. And actually, I was treated very well, I've got to say. I was treated better there than certain churches I've been invited to, I can tell you. And the majority of people said, "You're very." Started off their questions by saying, "You're very brave to be here." There were one or two who were unpleasant, and it's very interesting actually that the first person who started off by being unpleasant and by sort of verbally abusing me, he was booed by the other atheists.
Oh, good.
Yeah, and then afterwards there were people who wanted some who wanted to ridicule me, but then there was quite a sizable group of people who said, "Look, no, we'd like to talk to you further and just find out really why you think the way you do." And I spent another sort of couple of hours after the meeting had finished talking with a group of people, sharing over a drink and just generally talking, and had a very, very nice evening.
Nice. So do you think that the growing atheist community, which I think is one of the good results of the, new atheist movement, and I'm also getting information from viewers that the new atheist movement is a very loosely defined term, and I accept that, but I accept it, for the purposes of this discussion, that most people know what I'm talking about when I say that. That's a good end result of that from my perspective as an atheist is that there is a growing atheist community that people can access if they need to. Something that I wish that I had when I was growing up and I had my journey.
There's plenty of sensible and intelligent atheists around who, like yourself, who you can have a discussion with. The thing about the sort of new atheists, and there isn't an organisation as such, many of them have different views. You read their books. Sam Harris's views are not identical to Richard Dawkins, not identical to Christopher Hitchens. Nevertheless, these people do know each other, or did know each other in the case of Christopher Hitchens, obviously, and these people are familiar with each other and sort of support each other to some extent. I suppose one of the sort of rising stars of that movement would be Lawrence Krauss.
Yes.
And I think the danger that they have is that they want to impose their views on other people. They want laws passed which will prevent this or that sort of thing happening. And there seems to be very much a fundamentalism around there, which doesn't happen, generally speaking, in what you might want to term the fundamentalist Christian community, with one or two exceptions.
Okay. Well, I actually wanted to address that because that kind of dips into a little bit about the topic I wanted to address about science education and scientific literacy of the general public. But I'd like to hold off on that because I would like to bring your book into the mix. Because speaking of pivoting back to evidential apologetic, your newest book, The 6 Days of Genesis, The 6 Days of Genesis is a book of yours, but it's not your newest book. Your newest book is Don't Miss the Boat. And I recommend people, that are interested in reading information about, the kind of books that Paul writes. This is about the Noahic flood. It has some chapters that have to deal with science. It has some chapters that have to deal with scripture. The last couple chapters are like fictionalized gospels written as if Noah had written them, as well as other people. Am I giving a fair paraphrasing and a synopsis of your book?
Correct. Yes, there was 4 short stories, fictional short stories, to try and explain some of my ideas about what the world might have been like before the flood, and that was. I started off by saying this is obviously going to be conjecture. So I wrote 4 short stories set from the views of the 4 children of Lamech. There are 2 Lamechs mentioned in Genesis. The Lamech I'm referring to is not Lamech, the father of Noah, but Lamech, the great-grandson of Cain. and he had 4 children, 3 sons and 1 daughter. So those are the fictionalized stories. The Gospel According to Noah wasn't a piece of fiction. That was actually looking at what the Bible's teaching about the gospel of Jesus Christ, actually in the book of Genesis, and showing that that same gospel message is actually there in that account.
Okay. And what inspired you to write this book?
I've clearly always been very interested in the subject of the flood, and it's something where people who like to call themselves creation scientists, they're always going to be interested in that. It's a term I don't tend to use about myself because, for the simple reason, of course, I get a lot of emails from people saying, "Well, you don't know anything about science," which clearly they haven't ever done any research about me. Otherwise, they'd know I did. But it is quite correct, technically, to say that I am not a scientist. I'm not a scientist. A scientist is somebody who is whose job, at least at some point in their life, not necessarily their entire life, but at some point in their life, they have done professional scientific research. I never have. You know the old argument, the old joke that to those who can do and those who can't teach.
Oh, yeah.
Well, I was one of those who couldn't, so I taught. I was a science educator. So to call myself a creation scientist would therefore be wrong. So I tend to use creationist or biblical creationist rather than creation scientist because I've never been a professional scientist. But I was interested when I first became a Christian, when I first found out about people not believing the theory of evolution. I was interested in the historic book, The Genesis Flood by Whitcomb and Morris. In more recent years, the science of that has been updated in a book by Andrew Snelling called Earth's Catastrophic Past. And one of the things I've found is that there's quite a lot of literature, scientific literature, that goes into a great deal of depth into flood geology. It's highly sophisticated. A lot of people don't realize that literature exists, and the peer-reviewed scientific literature. But it goes over the heads of most Christians, and clearly my book was addressed to Christians from that point of view. It was not an argument book in that sense to try and convince atheists, to be honest. And such a book could and should be written, but this particular book was not it. It was a book for Christians. I wanted to take this heavy science and, well, I'll use the phrase, I wanted to dumb it down and make it so that the ordinary person in the pew, as it were, could
make it You wanted to make it user-friendly.
Correct, and I don't think anyone else had done that. I think people had dumbed down certain aspects of things, but I don't think anyone had written a whole book about the flood in a dumbed down language, and that's what I wanted to do, and I hope that's what I've tried to achieve.
So I'm glad that you brought up that your background is in science education, because I would like to talk about science education a little bit. I mean, what would your response be to some critics that, level the argument that the information in books like this, particularly the scientific evidence that you use, actually interferes with the scientific literacy of the general population?
Well, that's just nonsense, isn't it?
Why would it be nonsense? Because the science that you reference in the peer-reviewed journals that they exist in are they're of a vanity style, like they are peer-reviewed within Christian Science journals, not necessarily the intellectual commons of the peers of their field.
All peer-reviewed journals take a party line on issues. You have a look at all peer-reviewed journals anywhere in the world on any particular subject. They all take a party line, and they all involve PhD professional scientists. So the particular creation scientist peer-reviewed journals would do that, and in many ways their selection process is more rigorous than many in the secular world. And of course, many of the people who have contributed to them have also had peer-reviewed articles in secular journals published too. If you want to talk about science education, as you said, my background is in science education. Perhaps your audience would want to know that I spent 20 years teaching in what you would call public schools in Britain. We don't call them public schools, we call them the state government schools. So I spent 20 years in that. I was promoted several times. I was eventually a head of science. Every school I taught in knew my creationist views, as did all the education authorities, but I was frequently promoted because presumably they liked the way that I taught. I think I was pretty good at that job.
I
My
have.
master's degree is education. So I was at one point in the late 1980s on a focus group in the northwest of England. This is one of many focus groups that was working towards the introduction of the national curriculum in science in England and Wales. So my background has been in education, and it's very important that children learn scientific process and learn how to be able to think through things critically. And the
I agree with that.
more extreme atheists who have wanted to change education have been profoundly anti-scientific in the way that they have wanted to address that.
Please go on with this. Please explain that a little bit.
Well, there is this myth, of course, that people like me want to ban the teaching of evolution from schools. There may be some naive creationists who sometimes say things like that, but it's actually people in creation ministries don't tend to say things like that, because clearly any view that is taught, that is believed by a large number of scientists, has got to be taught, whether it's correct or not. It is the prevailing view and must be taught. The issue is if that you are going to teach the theory of evolution to a class of school children as if it were an established fact, and then immediately prevent them from questioning it in any way and examining it in a scientific manner. So to do that is profoundly anti-scientific.
So how do you recommend they go about questioning it? So do you recommend that they are taught how to question it?
Absolutely.
In what way?
How to question it.
Explain how that curriculum would look.
Well, Great Britain used to have that curriculum. You can still see it. Like actually, Wales still does. The English national curriculum has changed slightly on the subject of evolution only, but the rest of the curriculum is still good. The preamble to the national curriculum prior to 2007 in England used to say pupils must be taught about scientific controversies, and actually gave us an example of that, Darwin's theory of evolution. When the national curriculum was put into place in England and Wales, it had 4 attainment targets. Attainment target 2 was called life science, so that's clearly biology. Attainment target 3 was material science, so that was basically chemistry and earth science. And attainment target 4 was physical science, in other words, physics. But attainment target 1 was called the exploration of science. And I was always, as a science teacher, very excited about attainment target 1. It wasn't to be taught separately, but it was the way that pupils should be taught about all science. In other words, it's about exploration.
That assumes that there's a controversy about the theories like evolution, theories like the Big Bang. There are controversies within the scientific community, maybe about the mechanisms of it, but there's not a controversy about it being the accepted consensus among experts.
Well, that, of course, is not correct. There are many, including many secular scientists, even some atheist scientists, who don't accept the Big Bang theory. That's quite common.
But many is a handful as compared to the consensus of experts.
No, it's not a handful. It's actually quite large when you actually go into the community. Now, in the case of the theory of evolution, there's a greater cultural problem. Anecdotally, I know from scientists that I'm aware of in major universities, including Russell Group universities in the United Kingdom, that there are a large number of people who question the theory of evolution, don't accept many of its tenets, and don't accept even the premise in the first place, but who are afraid to actually speak out. Because there is a cultural issue over.
And these are people in the field of biology, or are these like people that study something completely separate from biology?
No, I'm referring to the field of biology.
Okay, I find that hard to believe, considering that working in a laboratory with biologists, not one of them rejects the. So anecdotally, I don't know anyone who works in the field of biology that does not accept evolution, and also the. Scientific consensus, there would almost have to be a conspiracy to hide the fact that more people than a handful, then it is more than just a fringe theory that things like evolution aren't accepted as the consensus. And once again, I'm not appealing to majority, but a consensus among experts is not appealing to the majority of people that are not familiar with, intimately involved in a specific field. So the reason why I bring this up. The reason why I bring this up is because I really do think that it's important that the scientific literacy of the general public be raised to the level of, the current level of what is known. And I think that there are people that would argue that introducing science to manifest in conclusions of creation would be changing the very criteria of science itself in order to allow supernatural variables in, therefore circumventing the methodological naturalism, and it therefore not being science. So why would you allow that science into the classroom, or those kinds of questions that is derived from as valid questions about science, in the same sense that you don't use a football bat because you can't combine baseball rules when you play football? Why would you want to change the rules of science to allow something that it shouldn't allow in it?
I don't want to change the rules of science. That's one of the myths that there are. And you said quite a lot of things and thrown out quite a lot of things, most of which are highly contentious. I mean, you talk about methodological naturalism. That's a worldview. That's a bias.
That's philosophical naturalism.
It's a bias, and it's a worldview through which people want to view the evidence.
It's a criteria upon which to utilize an instrument.
If I can finish my point, it would be rather nice to be able to have this discussion where I'm able to finish my point. My point is that it is inappropriate to teach children in such a way that one view and one view only is steamrolled, so that there is no possible method of their applying critical thinking to a particular area of the curriculum. I'm very, very keen that is the case, and it's very important indeed that children know how to criticize things from a scientific point of view and know about the scientific principles, procedures, processes of hypothesization, of experimentation, and of reporting and observations and so on. It's very important that they do that, and that's the sort of thing that I argue for in a science curriculum.
I think that we're on the same page about that, about wanting children to be able to utilize critical thinking and have a skosh of skeptic. Everyone should be like a little mini researcher in sense, and they should have the skills, the critical thinking skills available to come out with, valid conclusions. That's why criteria are so important. And that's one of the reasons why I brought up methodological naturalism. And I would like you to explain, for my own clarity, what the difference, why you would say methodological naturalism is a worldview when it's specifically called methodological as compared to philosophical naturalism. I'd like you to talk about that, please.
Well, you can't entirely divorce the two. There is a view that you do not bring God into the laboratory, into the background explanation of anything you do. But that is simply not appropriate to make that distinction, because as soon as you make that distinction, you're saying that only one possible worldview is appropriate as a background. And of course, historically, that was never the case. I would argue that the overwhelming majority of discoverers of the modern scientific era were made by people who believed in God, and in many cases believed the Bible to be literally true. So to ignore that sort of point of view makes very little sense, and to say that it's not appropriate at any point to appeal to supernaturalism is again not in my view something that is scientific in the way that I understand it, because it's actually cutting off one particular area of research. People often accuse creationists of believing in the God of the gaps, something that Richard Dawkins makes a lot of. He says, you only believe what you believe because it just fills in some of the gaps for you. Mm-hmm. And it's very interesting then that he sort of looks at particular mechanisms and says, we don't know at the moment how these evolve, but one day we will, because he appeals to the evolution of the gaps all the time.
Well, that's one way of looking at it. Now, as far as methodological naturalism, and after this, unless there's more things to add to it, I'll leave it alone because I don't want to beat a dead horse. But it's a criteria for science because science is limited in its scope, and the scope is to look for natural answers to natural phenomena. And so to allow supernatural variables either into your hypothesis or into an explanation of your conclusions opens up a whole can of worms of who determines what the range of supernatural variables are. Why don't we allow leprechauns? Why don't we allow invisible pink unicorns? I mean, if we're going to allow the supernatural, why end with God?
You know that's a straw man argument, don't you? You're not comparing like things at all, simply because you do not view things from one worldview, and the concept of imposing methodological naturalism on things is imposing one particular, basically atheist worldview, and that is simply not appropriate in scientific.
Well, it's secular. It's not atheist, and atheism isn't a worldview. So I'd like to have that discussion with you as well. That atheism. I mean,
atheism is a worldview.
Say that one more time.
Of course, atheism is a worldview. You
okay,
view everything
before I defend it.
Belief in God.
Go ahead, say that one more time. I'd like to defend
it. You view the world through your lack of belief in God.
I don't view that's not the whole of my worldview. My worldview is about positive assertions. And atheism is by definition a negative assertion. So if you were to draw a pie chart about my worldview, the fact that I don't believe in God would be a mere sliver. Because it's just something that I don't believe in. It's a very small part. Now, I do have a show where I talk to theists and atheists, so as far as my hobby world, it's a huge part of my hobby world. I'll be the first to admit that.
You're at 0.6 on Dawkins' 7-point scale, and are you like he is himself?
I'm at a 6, but that doesn't mean that it's a worldview. My worldview comes from secular humanism tenets more than it does from atheism, which is a non-term.
Okay,
which is a non-worldview.
If I throw out a comment like that, obviously I understand that your worldview is a lot more sophisticated than that, and it's not. It would be offensive of me to suggest that you can sum it up in one sentence. I wasn't trying to do that, but I was simply saying it's certainly going to colour the way that you think, because it is your belief system. And yes, and obviously there's going to be all various writings and so on that secular humanists have put together, some of which you will accept, some of which you will reject. I know it's going to be a lot more sophisticated than that, but the point I'm making is that you are going to view the world. All right, we'll talk about secular humanism. You're going to view the world through a secular humanist sort of philosophy, of course.
Yes, and that is
views within that.
Sure, and that would fall under the umbrella term of atheism, but I don't see atheism as a worldview. But to get back to the topic where that even came up, science isn't secular, or science isn't atheistic, it is secular. So I think that I've heard you say that. I've heard you say before that science presupposes that there is no God. I think you're starting from a top-down approach that really misinterprets where science is coming from, where I would implore you to think about it from a bottom-up approach where science really presupposes that the universe exists and that the universe is knowable. And then from there, building models about reality. And we just have yet to need to inject the God variable.
Actually, that's not the way that I see it working at all, and I reject the idea that science is secular, because since science is about understanding the universe, and the universe was created by God, then I would take the same view as Isaac Newton, that actually scientists are simply thinking God's thoughts after him.
But Isaac Newton believed in a very different God than you do. He didn't believe in the.
Oh yes, Trinity. He was a Unitarian. Yes, I know that.
Oh, okay. So that seems like apples and oranges to me. So, but I mean, I have no problem with if you believe science is looking into the mind of God. That makes sense, and it's a beautiful metaphor. But that doesn't philosophically or logically lead to science not having natural answers for natural phenomena.
Of course it does, because philosophically it isn't possible really to understand how the laws of science come about without a belief in the existence of God, because you have no basis for understanding why there should be laws of science, why you expect scientific experiments to give you the same results under the same conditions. There is no expectation of that really. If we
so that's when you dip into the precept.
Chance.
That's when you dip into the precept.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Well, so that'll end the discussion part. I just wanted to raise the point that, the scientific literacy of the general public is a point that resonates with me for several reasons, not the least of which is I think that a mini model of the scientific method is necessary for individuals to engage in critical thinking about many topics that are important for the citizenry. And
Yes,
I think that trying to change the criteria of science by doing away with methodological naturalism is a handicap and will handicap the future of American citizens because it'll prevent them from understanding the real science that's going out there. That's just my opinion.
It is your opinion. It's an opinion I profoundly disagree with. Apart from the bit that I said that I do agree with, which is that scientific literacy needs to be increased. I would agree with that. There is a problem with scientific literacy. But scientific literacy is not assisted by atheist propagandists who want to ban any sort of discussion in high schools on a particular area of the science curriculum.
Well, pre-college teaching of evolution and science is like a whole completely different science education, and what gets into the textbooks and how it's taught is a completely different discussion than what is taught at the college level and what information should be provided to students and the level of critical thinking that is available and the amount of time that is available for certain topics. So, I mean, I'd love to have another conversation with you disassembling those very details in the science education process. But for now, I'd like to start on some of the concluding questions. Some of these are a little rough. I expect this to be kind of like a lightning round, so feel free to be as pithy or as detailed as you would like with the answers.
Okay.
So we'll start with the first one. Would the world be better off without atheists?
No.
Okay. And do you mind giving a little bit more about that answer?
Well, a biblical worldview is that you're entitled to whatever view you wish to have. You're not going to be forced into any particular view. The point is that if there is a view which I believe is correct, which is the biblical view, then I need to be able to have the freedom to be able to explain that and to be able to attempt to convince you that that is true. In order to be able to convince you, there shouldn't be any coercion on you to have that particular view in the first place. Otherwise, it would make no sense if you came to a view by coercion only. Therefore, it's logical that people need to be free to choose views that they like, including atheism.
Okay. What evidence would disprove your worldview or position?
None. My worldview is presuppositional, and it's not based out of a belief in God. It's based out of knowing God.
Just as a side question, is there any evidence that would disprove the creation science that you use?
No, none at all.
So then it isn't science. It's not falsifiable.
It's a presupposition.
Okay. All right. What question would you most like to be asked by an atheist?
Yeah. I suppose if you want a quick sort of recap on the last bit, there'll be plenty of models within what people refer to as creation science that are falsifiable and that need to be adjusted. You said that you were a particular fan of Kent Hovind's views, and you probably know that he used to teach. Well, he still does teach that the Earth before the flood was covered with a water vapor canopy.
Vapor canopy theory,
which, for example, is something that most creationists don't accept. I certainly don't accept. So there are different models of things and different sort of scientific research. What question would I most like to be asked?
Yes.
The question I would most like to be asked is the same question that Paul and Silas were asked in the jail, which is, what can I do to be saved?
Okay. And what would your response be?
My response would be that what you need to do to be saved is to understand that you have broken God's law, and that you would repent of breaking God's law and put your trust and faith in Jesus Christ. Okay.
What is the least? What question would you least like to be asked by an atheist?
I don't know. Any question which is a fair question is perfectly acceptable to ask. I suppose one of the questions that, well, it's not that I don't like being asked it. It amuses me, but it also saddens me, which is the question, why do you creationists tell lies? Or why do you creationists attempt to mentally abuse our children? And of course, those are the sorts of questions. They're on the same sort of philosophical level as have you stopped beating your wife yet? Because they're not capable of a rational answer because there is a false presupposition behind the question.
Yeah, I don't think that's totally unfair. I'm sorry that you get people that say things like that.
Yes.
Because I certainly do not think that you're lying. Of course, I'm challenging you, Paul, but I hope that you don't think that I'm being disrespectful.
No, that's right. That's quite correct. And sensible atheists like yourself will never ask that sort of question. The people who ask that sort of question are very naive, and there are, you and I have both criticised atheists, and people who are listening to this mustn't think that there are Christians who I will not criticise, because there are many Christians who embarrass me greatly, and I'm sure you could easily come up with a list of people, and I would be very embarrassed by being associated with such people. So I'll lay myself open to that one for the sake of the fact that you have been honest and said there are people who disagree with you that you disagree with. The idea of saying somebody saying why are you telling lies is nonsense. It's just.
I mean, I still can't say that I have my head wrapped around why you believe what you believe, but at least you're honest enough to come on my show and to talk about it.
I believe what I believe because I believe that these things are revealed by God, because it is not possible to know anything without the existence of God. It's only possible to know things if I know everything that there is to know, which would make me God, or if I happen to know somebody who knows everything and has revealed some of it to me. And it's that second position, obviously. I do know somebody who knows everything, that is God, who has chosen to reveal some of that.
See, I've always found that position interesting just for one reason, and it's there seem to be, I was about to say there are two kinds of people in the world, the kind of people that say there are two kinds of people in the world and the kind that don't. But there seems to be a dichotomy of people that look for a certain amount of certainty in the world, that are looking for the certainty. And the position that you just laid out, that I hear a lot from presuppositionalists, it seems that presuppositional argument satisfies the conviction to be certain. And there's a whole handful of us that are happy with a life based on provisional knowledge and relative certainty. So, I mean, can you speak to that a little bit? Am I making sense to you?
No, I'm not, don't fully understand the question, except that I think there is a misunderstanding sometimes, and some of the things, therefore, that someone like me will say will come across as sounding arrogant, and perhaps I will, because you say, well, how can you possibly know that God exists? In the same way that I know you exist, it's possible that somebody could say, well, there's no such person as Christopher Mort, no such person. And I say, well, I've had a Skype conversation with him. I assumed he existed before when I got emails, but, so there's a Skype conversation there. He has a rather nice front room where his computer's based. I can see pictures on the walls. Therefore, there is a knowledge claim. And I am making a knowledge claim because, people, you ask for evidence that God exists, and yet the book of Hebrews actually says at the beginning of Hebrews chapter 11, faith is the let me get this quote absolutely right, because it gets misunderstood if I get the quote wrong. But one of the clauses there is saying that faith is the evidence of things unseen. Faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. So our claim then is that faith is actually not something that requires evidence. Faith is itself substantial, it's a substance, and it is itself the evidence. The fact that I have faith because I know God is itself the evidence that God exists.
Mm-hmm. But I was talking about more the certainty, like you are certain that God exists. You are certain that logic, truth, and reason follow from your knowledge, your certain knowledge that God exists. These arguments that we hear over and over again from presuppositionalists, it begs the question for me: why do you need all of this certainty? when the world pretty much exists on provisional knowledge and relative certainty?
Well, of course, you see, I reject that. I think the world exists on certain knowledge because there are some things that we know for sure. And the fact that we know them for sure is because we live in a world that's created by God. But it's a world that is known, and it's a God who is known. And it's not a question of theory. You see, I was brought up to believe in God, to have a mental assent to believing in God, but I didn't know who he was. Now, one day when I was about 17 years old, I actually came to know God for who he was, and know him as a person from that point. And when I'm talking to someone like yourself, you're being very polite in that. And this is something that you can't share in that sense because you don't know that, and you can't get beyond this barrier of thinking, well, this is a viewpoint that he has, and I understand that. But I would just say that that it is not a viewpoint. I know God as a real person.
Okay, and that works for me because I don't necessarily need for you to I don't want to disabuse you of your beliefs. I love the fact that you are a great person, and the great person that you are is informed by your world belief, and your world belief is informed by the Bible. I don't necessarily need evidence for God, but it's when it takes the next step where obviously your beliefs and the evidences that you use could impact things that resonate with me, like science education, because we do have that disagreement about the criteria of science. And I think that would impact things like my nephews and nieces' education in the future.
I don't see why it should. Can you accept the fact that looking into my biography, that I taught science for 20 years, and that I was promoted several times during that. That presumably people thought that I was a very good classroom teacher. I left the teaching profession voluntarily, as I wanted to go into business. Actually, not into ministry. I went into business first, running an IT training business mainly because I don't know whether things happen the same way in America as they do in Britain, but basically what happens when you get promoted in Britain in teaching, you leave the classroom a bit. Every time you get a promotion for doing well in the classroom, you find you're doing less in the classroom. Mm-hmm. And my next step, having become a head of science, where I was doing slightly less teaching and a bit more paperwork and organising, my next step after that would have been to become a vice principal of a school. I was acting vice principal while the principal of the school was ill and the vice principal was acting up to principal. And I hated that particular role, the paperwork.
The administrative, instead of hands-on.
Yeah, I spent 20 years in the classroom enjoying that particular role, and I would argue being pretty good at it. And therefore, you should be reassured that somebody with a Christian value and a biblical value who sees the need for critical education, because I believe that critical thinking is something that people should be learning about biblically, it actually works. And therefore, your concern...
Well, but here's my concern. Here's where my concern is born out of. As this is the second time you've brought up your bona fides as a science educator, and I do not want to, I don't want to besmirch the fact that you are telling the absolute truth and that you've had that experience. But we're talking about real science, and you admitted that you're not a scientist, and teaching science is different than doing science, and. As fantastic as a teacher as you were, that doesn't necessarily give your opinion any more leverage or merit in the present conversation.
As far as education was concerned, many of my colleagues, some of my colleagues were Christians, some of my colleagues were atheists, some were not sure. One or two of my colleagues were Muslims. It didn't make a difference in most cases to their educational ability. In each of those camps, there were good science teachers and bad science teachers. Mm-hmm. As far as the education is concerned.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So, what is the best argument you've heard against your position?
I have never heard a good argument against my position.
What's the worst argument you've heard against your position?
Well, the worst argument tends to be from those who think in a lazy way, those who say, who would start by impugning my character, the arguments that would impugn the characters of all Christians, usually trying to oppose Christianity by association with things that I would find problematic anyway, like saying Christianity has only ever given rise to things like the Crusades or the Spanish Inquisition or things of that sort, which those sort of comments are not arguments against Christianity. Because I would argue anyway that some of those things, Spanish Inquisition in particular, was not something that was done by Christians anyway.
Okay. And would you expect to find God if the Bible were not here to guide you?
Would I expect to find God if the Bible were not here to guide me? Yes, because in the book of Romans it tells us that since the creation of the world, God's invisible attributes have been clearly seen in the things that are made, so that men are without excuse.
All right. So those wrap up my questions, Paul. I really appreciate you taking the time out to have this conversation with us today. I also appreciate the fact that even though you were a little bit late, you were still able to join us. And for everybody that is watching, I'm going to have a post-show wrap-up that I'm going to post on my YouTube channel. And then, of course, as soon as this video is uploaded to the New Covenant Group's YouTube channel, I will be mirroring it on mine. Once again, that is user/Mauteman. That's MAUTEMAN. And that'll do it for today's Meeting of the Minds. Thanks again, Paul.
Thank you very much.
Take care.